Welcome back to the third episode of the low FODMAP diet treatment video. This is episode 3 where we look at the FODMAP foods. Now, you will have been sent a link to a handout, which is basically a copy of all the slides in this third webinar, so that you have all the information available at your fingertips. Because here we're going to really concentrate on the foods that you need to avoid and, more positively, the foods that you can safely enjoy. I'm going to start off by explaining which are the FODMAP foods that need to be restricted. They are fructans, galacto-oligosaccharides, polyols, fructose and lactose. But please don't worry about those words. We're going to go into more detail about each of those as we go along. So let's start with the negative side, as in what foods need to be avoided. Well, if we look at the fructans, there's a large array of fruit and vegetables. I'm not going to start going into each one with you because you're going to have the handout, so you'll have all that information close at hand. Other fructans are found in things like wheat flour, spelt pasta, rye flour, barley, etc. Interestingly, wheat and barley also contain another FODMAP, galacto-oligosaccharides, but the most important thing is that these flours contain fructans. Fructans are also found in some of these teas, and they're also found as prebiotics. This is the food for the gut bacteria, often labelled in foods as FOS or inulin. Galacto-oligosaccharides revolve predominantly around beans and pulses. So things like baked beans, lentils, kidney beans, etc. are all high in galacto-oligosaccharides and need to come out of the diet. Polyols cover xylitol, mannitol, sorbitol, and sorbitol is evident in quite a few fruit and some other foods. Things like sugar-free chewing gum, for instance, all of these will need to come out of the diet. And another polyol, mannitol, is found in things like cauliflower, celery, sweet potato, and some mushrooms. Fructose is the sugar found in fruit. Now, it's not in a high enough quantity in a lot of fruit to be an issue, but it is high in things like apples, pears, cherries, figs, mangoes, watermelon, and dried fruit. It's also added to some foods like yogurts and things like cranberry juice, which has a very drying effect on the palate. They add fructose syrup there to try and make it sweeter and more palatable. So you do need to read your labels. Lactose is the sugar in dairy, which is found predominantly in milk, yogurt, and ice cream. And I'll go into lactose in a bit more detail in a minute. So first of all, I want to really concentrate on the fructans in wheat, barley, and rye, because I want to explain a little bit more background to this. So if we look at a wheat grain, in a wheat grain, you have two predominant elements: the gluten, which is the protein, and the fructans, which is the FODMAP, the carbohydrate. Now, the arrow is pointing at the fructans because with the FODMAP diet, that's what we're interested in. We're not interested in the gluten. Gluten has nothing to do with the FODMAP diet. So the learning point here is that the fructans are poorly absorbed in everyone, as we have no ability to break them down. The fructans in wheat, barley, and rye can cause IBS symptoms. The gluten is nothing to do with IBS. So what do you do about the foods you eat if you're taking out wheat, barley, and rye? Well, gluten-free foods are very useful because you can piggyback on the back of those. It's not because the gluten, but it's because those gluten-free foods have no wheat, barley, and rye in by definition, and therefore they're suitable for people to use as part of the low FODMAP diet. The type of bread that is more palatable if you don't want to use gluten-free bread is spelt sourdough bread. Now, the secret here is it needs to be bread made with 100% spelt flour, no other flour, and it needs to be used to make sourdough, which takes 5 to 6 hours to prove. And during that proving process, it basically breaks down any remaining FODMAPs in that, or fructans in that spelt flour, and makes spelt sourdough very suitable for FODMAP patients. It's quite difficult to find because a lot of bakers find spelt quite difficult to work with. It doesn't rise so easily, so they'll often make a spelt and rye loaf or a mixture of flours. Now, you can't have that. You have to have it made with 100% spelt flour. The only shop where I know you can get that is Waitrose, which does 100% spelt sourdough It's ready sliced in a packet, fresh, and you can buy it from the Waitrose shops. But you may also find that artisan bakers will make you some 100% spelt sourdough if you ask them to. So the alternative starchy foods that you're going to use when you're taking out wheat, barley and rye are going to be rice, rice noodles, potatoes and oats. And you can also eat buckwheat, polenta, quinoa, millet and sprouted pearl barley. And you can have barley malt extract if that's included an ingredient. Now, patients with celiac disease cannot have barley malt extract. They have to have a very, very strict gluten-free diet. But for a FODMAP patient, barley malt extract is not relevant, so you don't need to worry about it. So let's have a look at the lactose side now. I promised that I would go into this in a bit more detail. So the learning point here is that you only need to restrict lactose if you suffer with diarrhea or loose stools. If your IBS is mostly constipation dominant, then you do not need to restrict lactose and you can ignore the low lactose side of the FODMAP diet. But if you are going to do the low lactose side of the diet because you've got loose stools as part of your IBS, it's important to remember that this is not a dairy-free diet. You can still eat cheese, you can still eat butter, you can still eat cream. You don't have to restrict those in the slightest. And it's important to reiterate that IBS is not caused by allergy, as we mentioned in an earlier episode. It's not caused by dairy allergy either. So the learning point is that dairy allergy and lactose intolerance are two completely different conditions. Lactose in dairy can cause IBS symptoms, but dairy proteins, which cause dairy allergy, are not responsible for IBS. Therefore, for IBS, you only need to limit your intake of the high lactose dairy foods like milk, yogurt, and ice cream. So you could simply use the lactose-free milk and yogurt or the nut-based milks and yogurt. Plant-based milks that are suitable for the FODMAP diet would be almond milk, hazelnut milk, macadamia milk, so all those nut milks. It's important to know that some plant-based milks actually have quite a high FODMAP content, and I've listed here, and you'll see on your handout, this exact page which lists the different types of plant-based milk and how much you should limit those to per session so that you don't have too much of a high FODMAP content. So let's get on to the more interesting side now. What can you eat? What fruit and vegetables can you eat? Because there seems to be such a huge list of what you can't eat that it can be easy to think, oh my Lord, I'm going to have absolutely nothing to eat now. But here is the list of what you can eat, and there are a lot. So there are plenty of suitable vegetables on the low FODMAP diet, so there's no reason to have a lack of fibre or a lack of fruit and veg in your diet. Aim to have at least 3 portions of vegetables per day, and there's no upper limit on how many vegetables you can have in one sitting. One portion is about 80 grams, but to be honest, you can eat as much vegetable as you like. And all the salady vegetables like the tomatoes and the peppers and the carrot and the cucumber are all on here as well. So more FODMAP safe vegetables here. So there really is plenty for you to be having. You can have some of these which have got FODMAP content, but you have to have them in limited amounts. I tend to suggest to patients to avoid these if at all possible, but if you really need them, then choose one per meal and keep it within the limits listed on the page. And if you're on a vegetarian or vegan diet, you may well need to supplement your diet with some of these foods. And again, choose one per meal and keep to the limits listed on the page. Here's a tip. So garlic and onions, we use them a lot in cooking, and it can seem slightly overwhelming that you've got to take them out. So the alternatives are things like garlic oil, which you can buy in all the supermarkets now, chives, the green part of the spring onions, not the white part, asafoetida powder. All of these can be used to replace garlic and onion flavour. And all other herbs and spices are absolutely fine to use. Be aware that stock cubes, gravy, garlic in dressings, passata with flavourings, flavour crisps, sauces, these can all include garlic and onion. And what I will also send to you along with the PDF of all these slides is a manufacturer's list. So manufacturers who make FODMAP friendly foods, including things like gravy and stock. So hopefully you'll find that helpful. Let's look at the FODMAP safe fruit. Plenty of fruit again for you to have. Aim to eat 2 portions of fruit spread throughout the day, and 1 portion is about 80 grams. So there's plenty to have. All the citrus fruit, for instance, the melons, the berries, etc., all absolutely fine on this diet. There are some extra fruit you can have, but in limited quantities. Again, as with the vegetables, I would say try and avoid them if at all possible. But if you need to have them, then keep them within these limits listed on the page. And here's another tip about dried fruit. Generally, I would say avoid dried fruit. But if you have to have dried fruit, you can have from this list in these quantities listed here, but just 1 serving per meal. So what other foods can you eat freely? So poultry, meat, fish, all absolutely fine. You can eat those completely freely. Eggs cooked in any way, shape or form, absolutely fine. Tofu, tempeh, mycoprotein, pea protein, all absolutely safe on the low FODMAP diet. And finally, nut butters, nuts and seeds, spirulina, brown rice protein, all totally acceptable. Nuts and seeds, we tend to say keep to 1 small handful per portion. And the only nuts you can't have are cashews and pistachios. All other nuts are fine. So that finishes our roundup of all the foods that you need to avoid and the safe foods to eat. Use your handout that I sent you the link to help take you through the FODMAP diet. Thank you.